Welcome to Trailblazers Hour. My name is Sela Malanga and I'm sitting here in Malawi with the warm heart of Africa. Trailblazers Hour is a youth-led and young professional-led knowledge space under ShareScreen Africa. It was created to spotlight emerging voices, fresh perspective, and bold leadership shaping our current and future climate and environmental actions. The Trailblazers community recognizes that young professionals like us are not just leaders of tomorrow, but we are active drivers of today. Today we're diving into human-wildlife conflict, a topic that sounds very big, but actually it's about the questions that young people already struggle with in everyday life. How do we live alongside wildlife in a changing climate? Instead of only thinking about fences and fields, let's start thinking about coexistence, innovation, and how our generation can help design solutions. So I encourage you and everyone listening today to bring your curiosity, share your experiences, and ask bold questions. Whether you have seen the conflict with first hand or it's something new to you, your perspective matters. Let's jump into today's Trailblazers Hour together. With this, I'm going to hand over to the host of tonight, Samantha Sitori, who is going to introduce our speaker and then get the ball rolling. Samantha, over to you.
Thanks, Stella. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and just giving a background on what we do here at Trailblazers. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Vusumzi Martins, who is a scientist with the National Research Foundation in South Africa's Environmental Observation Network, where he leads work on long-term sociological observation across South Africa's diverse landscapes. He also coordinates the socio-ecological systems thematic area, fostering collaboration between researchers, practitioners, and local communities. He holds a PhD in environmental science from Rhodes University and is a registered professional natural scientist. His work explores the intersection of ecology and society with a particular focus on human-wildlife interactions, biodiversity conservation, environmental governance, and sustainable natural resource management. Passionate about interdisciplinary conservation, Dr. Martins works to develop evidence-based solutions that support both biodiversity and people who depend on healthy landscapes. So please put your hands together as we welcome Dr. Vusumzi Martins. Welcome, Dr. Vusumzi.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction. Thank
We're
you.
really happy to have you here. I mean, your work, obviously speaks for itself, but a lot of people here, I'm sure, are very excited to hear about who you are and what you're doing. So before we even dive into today's topic, which is from conflict to coexistence, redefining human-wildlife conflict, we'd love to get to know you a little bit better. So can you tell us about your journey into conservation and what sparked your interest in studying the relationship between people and wildlife?
Great stuff. So I'm originally born from East London, South Africa, which is in the eastern part of South Africa. And typically, as a young African child, I was taught or trained to learn about the typical job careers like your teachers, your lawyers, your doctors. So I grew up wanting to be a doctor and applied to many universities, but couldn't get into medical school. So I had to do a bridging course, which was a BSc. I ended up falling in love with zoology being the study of wild animals, and wanted to get to know more about what goes on. And up until I got to my master's degree, where I did distribution and ecology of Sanengo monkeys, which are a very endangered species within the Southern African region. When I did my PhD, I had a big question of how do actually humans and wildlife interact? So that opened my eyes to the socio-ecological space, whereby I did my PhD studying the bushmeat hunting amongst people residing adjacent forests. and which interestingly sparked a broader career in the socio-ecological systems. Where now I'm currently sitting as the landscape scientist with FTON, whereby I'm also sitting as a socio-ecological system scientist, broadly looking at different aspects of how society and wildlife interact. So just briefly, that's my background and who I am at the moment. Thank you so much, Sam.
Wow, Vusi, it shows that, you had a dream to become a doctor, and here you are sitting as a doctor, It's actually a full circle moment, and I love that you spoke about your childhood and how you grew up thinking about careers and how a lot of young African children actually grow up thinking that their only careers in a certain field, but you were also exposed to zoology, and then you grew your interest as you studied through your master's all the way through to your PhD. I mean, it's very inspiring, and I'm sure for our audience here, it's inspiring to hear about how you grew in your journey and in your career. And just to the audience, if you guys have any questions for Vusi as we're going through this discussion and interview, please feel free to write it in the chat. I'll also include your questions as I speak to him, and so that you also, part of the conversation. So your work, Vusi, sits at the intersection of ecology and social systems and long-term environmental observation, right? So for those who may not be familiar with this approach, what does socio-ecological systems mean? And why is it important for conservation today?
Great stuff. Yeah, this is a very current kind of topic, right? So we need to understand that humans and wildlife don't exist alone. Basically, wildlife makes its own decision. Can't make its own decision in isolation. Neither can humans. Whilst human behavior is influenced by economics, governance, culture, education, etc., etc. Also, wildlife, on the other hand, the wildlife behavior is influenced by habitat quality, climate change, resource availability, and human activities. And these systems exist in influence to one another. This is exactly why we talk about socio-ecological systems. We recognize that people and nature do not exist in isolation, but exist in interlinked systems, and they occupy components in an integrated system. If I make a typical example, when an elephant herd in an area would increase, one would immediately want to mitigate the fact that there's an abundance in elephants and tend to blame the elephant. But the underlying causes may include habitat fragmentation, may include prolonged drought, may include climate change or expanded agriculture, or weakened governance systems, or changing land ownership. And we need to understand this as drivers towards this expanding elephant population. And it's important to view these in a socio-ecological systems or as complex socio-ecological systems. And also, where I'm sitting at the moment, long-term environmental observation is equally important, because these ecosystems don't just change over a couple of years, but it takes decades for ecosystems to change. And conservationists tend to make decisions based on short-term observations and miss the gradual changes, and ultimately determine coexistence or conflict as their failed intervention. Their interventions tend to fail. So interdisciplinary sciences allow us to integrate ecological and social research into understanding a complete landscape dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I think you've covered a huge topic here in terms of your response, where we're bringing social systems with ecological systems and showing how they merge, or where the parallels between the two, and how they're all both affected albeit differently, but they're affected by governance, by climate change, by factors out of our control, and sometimes that factors that are anthropogenic or human caused problems. So I like the example you gave of the elephants and the growing population, and then how sometimes even within our systems, whether it's community, whether it's within a national park, that our decisions also affect the life of the animal and the way in which they behave, etc. So, just as we speak more on this, the socio-ecological systems and the topic for today, from conflict to coexistence, for many years we've spoken about how human wildlife conflict, right? But there's now a shift towards talking more about coexistence, as you've mentioned, around socio-ecological systems. What's behind this change in thinking? Well, and why does this language we use matter? So this coexistence, from conflict to coexistence, why does this change in language matter?
Yeah, I think historically, interactions between humans and wildlife was primarily observed as conflict. And the key objectives was to probably reduce crop raiding or crop damage or livestock killings or livestock loss or probably attacks to human beings, which these issues are quite important issues, eh? And but the framing of conflict as a negative interaction is not the true definition of human wildlife interactions. Whilst coexistence, on the other hand, recognizes that this is a more broader and more interactive kind of topic. As we all know, people and wildlife have coexisted or shared the same landscapes for millennia, right? And conflict represents only just one outcome of those interactions. Alongside conflict, one may also see human wildlife tolerance, where humans tend to tolerate the presence of wildlife in their spaces, or vice versa. Um, uh, Wildlife tends to tolerate the presence of humans in their space, and sometimes this can be culturally driven, whereby in our culture you can't kill a certain animal because it has some cultural significance or has some cultural value, or this certain species performs a certain ecosystem service that is required by human beings, or is of benefit to tourism issues, or is of benefit to indigenous knowledge or indigenous development. Yeah, so that is important, that coexistence does not imply that conflict is absent, but rather it shows that the capacity of social ecological systems to manage these interactions in ways that are socially acceptable, economically viable, and also ecologically sustainable. So this shift changes the kind of questions conservationists ask. Instead of how do we eliminate conflict, we need to now ask what conditions enable people and wildlife to coexist in a long term. This shift basically moves conservation away from crisis management and moves it towards building resilient and adaptive governance and inclusive kind of decision-making systems. Yeah, I think that's to answer your question in a nutshell.
Mm. And I love how you used the language. And just coming off of what you said, the use of the language, especially around policy and strategy, or the actions that we take, affects the use of language impacts the strategy or the actions that we take towards a certain framing or a way of thinking and the perspective, as you've said. So basically, how I'm understanding is it that the interactions between humans and wildlife, you know, are based off of the language that are based off of how we view the perspective that we have of these interactions. So instead of viewing the interactions around conflict as maybe the dominant way in which people and wildlife interact, right? We need to
Yeah.
now recondition our perspectives in our minds to see that conflict is just one way of humans and wildlife interacting, but it's not the only way. There are other ways of coexisting. And I love how you said, you know, this question, what conditions enable people and wildlife to coexist in the long term? And I think that's a question that actually impacts policy, governance, and even just how we view wildlife. I want to give a small example, like in urban areas, how we view snakes, for example. That coexistence with snakes in the domestic space has always, especially in the African culture, you know, it's been born from conflict that we are not friends with with our snake brothers and sisters.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And
No,
you
and
know, it's
that's
always
just,
like,
just one. That's just one of the many human wildlife interactions that are seen as conflict. Like, for
exactly.
example, an owl sitting on top of your roof. In some cultures, it's observed as bad luck, whilst
Yeah.
the next door neighbor who has rats or has pests that the owl might terminate views the owl as an ecosystem service, an animal that actually eradicates the pest that is around the area. So it's not human wildlife interaction shouldn't really be framed as conflict, but conflict should be one of the aspects of human wildlife interactions.
Yes, and that's a great way of putting it. And I think that for me, this is one of the points that's hitting home. So, to carry on with the discussion, you know, Africa presents a fascinating context because we're home to extraordinary biodiversity. As you've mentioned, elephants, we've spoken about snakes and owls, you know, that exists alongside growing populations and changing landscapes. Where do you see the greatest opportunities and perhaps the biggest challenges for building lasting coexistence, as you've said, between people and wildlife across the continent?
I think I missed the first part of your question. Can you please
Oh,
repeat it
I
again?
was, oh, no problem. I said, you know, our continent, the African continent, presents a fascinating context because we're home to extraordinary biodiversity, such as the elephants that you mentioned, the snakes, owls, and different types of wildlife, flora and fauna, alongside that exist alongside a ever-growing population and the landscapes that change because of it. So the question was, where do you see the greatest opportunities and perhaps the biggest challenges for building lasting coexistence between people and wildlife across Africa?
Oh, great stuff. In my view, Africa presents a unique landscape as a whole. We are still viewed, or still are, one of the continents with the most diverse population of wildlife, or free ranging wildlife in the world. And yet, simultaneously, we are faced with vast socioeconomic challenges and vast socioeconomic transformation, whereby we've got population growth, expanding infrastructure, agricultural development, and these tend to increase the interactions between humans and wildlife. And to compound this, we have the growing impact of climate change, which also presents another pressure, which actually increases the interaction the human wildlife interactions. These are significant challenges, eh? But however, Africa seems to thrive over this. I remember reading a couple of papers for my PhD, which showed that because of hunting, there are empty forests. But in 10 to 15 years later, the same animals that were said to be locally extinct within a certain forest regenerated again. So it shows that many communities maintain long-standing cultural relationships with wildlife and have this indigenous knowledge within them to know that this is the time to harvest, this is the time not to harvest, and have this in-depth indigenous knowledge that probably us as scientists might not have, as we view things in a more shorter thing, as we want to publish papers or want to achieve a certain objective within our research study. And perhaps the greatest opportunity lies in integrating these strengths. So if scientific knowledge, indigenous knowledge, local governance, and modern technologies could be perhaps brought together with adaptive management systems, Africa has great potential of becoming the global leader in coexistence science, if I may put it that way. So, and one of the challenges that I think is the lack of putting together all these indigenous knowledge and wanting to work in silos, and that would actually be the downfall of Africa.
Yes, and I agree with what you're saying, especially around the use of traditional knowledge in understanding, animal behaviors, how they help us also understand our landscape and our environment, etc. And I just want to point to our participants here that you have written on some of these findings that you have from your PhD, one of which he wrote, Bushmeat hunting practices by rural communities in the forests of Eastern South Africa, motivations, techniques, and perceptions. A link will be provided in the chat for you guys to listen, to read it, and to see some of the work that he's done. But I just wanted to point to your work, Vusi, as we're going. And so linked to what you've just spoken about, there's a question in the audience. Amukelani Maluleke, says, great talk, Vusi, and there's are there any particular case studies on the continent or even in South Africa, as you've mentioned already, where human-wildlife conflict has been successfully managed? What would you regard as the main pillars of solving such issues?
Great stuff. Thank you so much, Amu, for the question. I know of several case studies and scenarios whereby humans and wildlife have actually coexisted through community participatory actions and community stewardship. So I know of case studies such as in Namibia and Kenya, which have proven to be success stories, whereby also cattle farmers have learned to live alongside prides of lions. So there are several case studies which have shown that with community intervention, proper governance, and proper conservation management, coexistence can be achieved. I hope that answers your question, Amu.
I think it did. I think you covered it, especially also because it was linked to your previous point. So yeah, thank you for that, Vusi. And so, we've heard a lot about climate change in the academic space and research, and now it's part of our policy. It's an issue that drives policy currently, where it's we know now from research and data that it's reshaping ecosystems and how people behave and how wildlife is now living and moving. How do you think climate change will influence human-wildlife interactions over the next few decades? And what should we prepare for now?
Yeah, that's one of the most pressing issues currently globally. Hey, and we know that climate change is here, and climate change is not going anywhere in the near future, and it's becoming one of the primary drivers of human-wildlife interactions, and rather than simply other biodiversity issues. And as we know, as temperature increases and also rainfall patterns become unpredictable, this alters the movement of wildlife, also the breeding patterns, also habitat use, and in search of water, etc., etc. And also human communities or human populations will also adapt to these changing through agricultural practices, expanding irrigation systems, or even relocating settlements into areas where there were formerly no human settlements. So these parallel responses will create, or it will inevitably create, patterns of interaction. I know that in South Africa, due to the emerging changes in fire regimes, there's been prolonged droughts and habitat transformations, and these are already altering ecological processes. So preparing for the future, I think we need to actually have a proactive thinking rather than reactive thinking. So we need to actually have climate-informed decision making or climate-informed conservation planning, landscape connectivities where that allows species to move freely amongst human populated areas, and early warning systems that are, yeah, that's one point that I think I should reiterate. Like, we need early warning systems in order to actually predict how climate might affect both the humans and the wildlife in a certain landscape. And perhaps more importantly, we need to, how can I put this? Have more long-term environmental monitoring, because climate impacts unfold over decades and decades. Without this long-term kind of data, as the unit I'm currently working on actually exhibits, we can't actually distinguish normal variability to long-term changes that it becomes extremely difficult to actually see how long-term changes actually compared to short-term variability. So I think that would be the answer to that questioning.
Thank you for that response. And I just want to add, in addition to what you've said, Holly Dublin wrote in the chat that she likes to posit that the idea of human wildlife conflict at the site level is a symptom and the true disease, similar to what you said, and is represented by many root causes or drivers, including climate change, increasing human populations, large-scale development such as agriculture, mining, etc., and the high levels of poverty, which is something I think also, you've been speaking about. High levels of poverty as well, yeah. Therefore, mitigating at the site level is like taking an aspirin when you actually have cancer. We need to address the drivers or root causes through integrated landscape planning and cross-sectoral policy integration versus the current silos we're working in. And she says, what do you think? Of which I think you sort of spoke to her point.
Exactly that. I think yeah, I've touched that a little bit. I think you're completely right. Hey, if we actually look at this at a minute level, we're overseeing, like we're missing out on a lot, and observing conflict as just as the overall thing. We actually need to actually look at different scenarios and actually put everything together in order to actually achieve the coexistence that we talk about.
Yeah, and yes, it's a holistic approach where it's not just a one size fit all, but like she said, and you've said, site specific ways of dealing with the root causes to human wildlife conflict as we've been speaking. Danny Bonisi Ndlovu also writes, the phenomenon of human wildlife conflict, of human wildlife interactions, my apologies, is mostly associated with larger spec hyenas, such as elephants, lions, hyenas, etc. Could it be that human wildlife conflict could also be the driver of biodiversity loss in some species, such as bird life? Let me know if you
I think we've already spoken about this. I know like for example, I'll just make a typical example on where I grew up. Hey, there used to be like a large amount of birds of prey, including owls, etc., etc. And due to the cultural belief that owls tend to have cause bad luck or are seen as taboo or whatever, they've been completely eliminated. We rarely see an owl sitting perched on a pole in our area. So the more than the more what I'm just lost of word, but more, the lions and the cheetahs, etc. The human wildlife conflict also is seen in the more smaller species or more less charismatic species, such as the project that I was working on as the bushmeat hunting project. People were actually hunting smaller antelope, and that is also another form of conflict, as I observed in my study. And it was never driven, in contrary to areas like in the West or Central Africa. It wasn't really driven by by poverty, but rather it was driven by culture and driven by sports. And that's a different form of interaction on its own. So observing human wildlife interaction as a holistic nature, as Sam mentioned, is integral in achieving this coexistence that we speak about.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I really like how you touched on this, you know. And so the next question actually goes into this a little bit. So because we often measure conservation success by counting species, right? It's like birds, for example, using them as indicators or protected areas. But if our goal is coexistence, as you've said, rather than simply protecting wildlife, should we also be measuring things like trust, community well-being, or governance? So we've spoken about policy a little bit, and we've spoken about culture, but should we use some of these social indicators that are difficult to measure? Like trust is difficult to measure, but can we use some of these, like trust, community well-being, or governance, to measure, you know, the success in you know, this coexistence between humans and wildlife, and what would success look like to you if we do that?
Absolutely, we need to actually integrate, as I've mentioned before, integrate these into modern day ecology. Right, species abundance and species counts remain very important, but when we measure coexistence, it requires us to have a broader definition of success. Right, a growing elephant population, for example, as I made, tells us whether the neighboring community feels secure. Oh, sorry, tells us very little about whether a neighboring community feels secure or whether they trust the governance issues or governance structures within that specific area, or whether they actually, these elephants are socially acceptable. So integrating these social aspect into today's species counts or species abundance is integral for us to achieving this coexistence that we believe. And also long-term coexistence also really depends on the resilience of the entire socio-ecological system. Yeah, success should therefore be measured by whether biodiversity and human communities actually thrive together, rather than only looking at whether the wildlife is thriving or decreasing. So measuring both the social aspects and also the ecological aspects. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And what you've just mentioned here in terms of the social, especially, I think I'm going to hammer a little bit onto that because what Jabulile Maseko also is asking a question, I think that dives deeper, and it's around politics, how politics plays a role in the coexistence of human and wildlife. Any thoughts on that about politics, specifically, I guess, how it affects, you know, human behaviors,
Yeah.
especially around wildlife?
As we can see currently, the political landscape basically affects any and everything. We are currently sitting at a level, especially in Africa, where at a political landscape whereby we are having deprived communities, communities who don't have access to water, communities who are the natural dependent on natural resources, and the poverty rate is high. So these human wildlife interactions are inevitable. You are going to have to go get water in a river infested with crocodiles. You are going to go have to harvest firewood in a forest filled with snakes or filled with other wildlife species. So the political nature of any and every country has a large influence on how human wildlife interactions actually occur or when they actually occur. So politics plays a huge influence on human wildlife interactions as a whole.
Absolutely. And I think politics, especially in the long term, it shapes the overall social political landscape that affects the way in which we govern these spaces, especially around national parks and communities. And we have Sasha Bornman, and she's a ranger on a mine in Palaborwa in Limpopo, South Africa. Actually, which is close to the Kruger National Park, another political space, especially around conservation in the social political landscape when you look at it. So her question is, we have 6,000 hectares property next to Kruger, where we have about 2,000 mine workers in operations and almost 200 elephants, lions, and other wildlife coexisting. It's not always easy, and like Dr. Vusi has said, not without conflict, but possible. I would like to know if, Doc, if you know of any species papers that one can look up on conflict management, especially with baboons. So is there anything you can also refer, some literature that you can refer people to, even some of your own, that so that we can also, take away some key materials that we can help our participants who are currently coexisting with these issues?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and you are doing amazing work as a ranger up there, and I'm sure it's not easy, Sash. Nonetheless, there's several papers that have been published throughout the country on specifically baboons, and I know mostly focused in the Western Cape and Cape Town area, whereby how to manage and how to to enhance this human wildlife interactions relating to baboons. I'm happy to probably my email will be shared. I'm happy to share a couple of papers that some of my colleagues have actually worked on that I could share with you, that actually draw out a nice picture on how to actually manage the baboon population whilst also keeping the local residents happy, if I may put it in layman terms like that.
So in your view, Dr. Vusi, what can conservation science learn from these indigenous and local communities that have traditional knowledge around this subject area? And how can we create genuine partnerships rather than simply consulting communities?
In a short answer, because this is a very long and broad thing, we can go on for days with this topic. I actually believe that scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge shouldn't be viewed as competing or opposing systems. Whilst scientific research probably often provides generalized explanations or predictive models, indigenous knowledge provides detailed place-based understanding, right? Developed over generations and generations and generations through people's lived experiences. Communities often know the seasonal wildlife movement, changes in behavior, ecological indicators, etc., that scientific monitoring may not actually capture. I personally, I believe that the future of conservation should therefore involve both these scientific models or predictive models alongside with this indigenous knowledge. This actually means involving communities from the beginning of a project rather than making them test subjects or merely data providers, where science is basically, and they come to extract the data and publish papers. They should be involved in the inception of projects, and when scientific evidence and local knowledge are genuinely integrated, conservation becomes more legitimate and more equitable and more often effective, rather than if we only use scientific methods or scientific predictions. That's my honest belief when it comes to integrating science and indigenous knowledge.
And I love that. And I would like to actually challenge the use of language where we say science is in one bracket and traditional knowledge is in another. Because traditional knowledge is a form of science, it's a form of knowledge, it's a form of understanding. Exactly. Because it seems like there's always a hierarchy between science and academic research, etc., and then traditional knowledge is somewhere down here. Where in essence that they're both legitimate forms of knowledge and understanding that have been, culminated over years or generations, as we've seen. And I think to make traditional knowledge or science in this case, better recognized, we actually have to see it as a form of knowledge that should be recognized in the academic spaces. And
exactly. Can I just interject there, Sam?
Please go ahead.
I read recently a paper on decolonizing conservation, and they actually speak highly of the influence of indigenous or traditional knowledge as a modern day science, rather than it being observed as a primitive way of people observing species or primitive way of doing things. Looking at indigenous knowledge as a modern day science. So I think it just reiterates what you just said just now.
Absolutely, yes. It's in the decolonizing conservation space. Absolutely. And it's again a topic we could go into discussion because it's a topic I'm also quite interested in. But I want to move on to some of the questions from our participants, and it's linked to this. Soletu writes, how do we balance constitutional rights to property, food security and safety with national obligations to protect biodiversity? And I think this is a very good question because it speaks to the values and the interests, where one side, we want to protect biodiversity and we want to uphold the livelihood, livelihoods of the people that live next to biodiversity. But some of the interactions, which are conflict, right, make it more challenging, for this to happen. So how do we balance the constitutional rights of property and food security versus the national obligation to protect biodiversity?
I think you cut there for a minute. Can you please just whose question is that?
Oh, my apologies. It's Soletu. She says, how do we balance constitutional rights to property, food security, and safety with national obligations to protect biodiversity?
I think as scientists or as conservationists, that's a space whereby we need to train very carefully, because you can't, for example, say, this is my property, and I come in and try to say, I'm trying to harvest certain things. So that's also a very a space where we need to train very carefully on, in order not to establish. I think this is more human to human conflict rather than a more human wildlife conflict. I don't know if that answers the question appropriately.
It's actually an interesting point that you've raised, that is more human to human, because again, it speaks to interests and what's the value behind those interests in terms of governance and what's prioritized within the policy space. Something I also observed during my field work, where yes, livelihoods are important, but sometimes the rights of animals supersede those of access to certain spaces because they're deemed as protected, etc., which is also a value for some. And those animals do deserve to be protected. So thank you for that. I want to look for the next question and then maybe read out some comments to you as we round up. So Hannah Lacey says, hi, thanks for the great talk. Hannah here, currently based in the UK, working on hippo conservation. With habitat loss and fragmentation reducing the functional connectivity, especially for wide-ranging species, is there a potential solution in the co-production of conflict mitigation actions or conservation planning with the communities that experience the negative impacts of sharing spaces with wildlife to help promote coexistence? So basically, she's asking, in terms of solutions,
Yeah.
are there any mitigating actions for conservation planning with communities that can help them decrease these negative impacts?
Um, thank you for that question. I think it really goes back to the what we've been trying to say. You come in a community that has been living with hippos. They know their issues. They actually know the answer to the questions that you are actually asking may actually lie within these communities. They, in most cases, they have lived with these species in coexistence for years. So I think it's very, very important to first do a community participatory exercise whereby you actually hear the views and opinions of the community members who are actually living with these hippos, rather than coming in and imposing your research or project within them. Find out what their perspective is with the conflict that they currently experiencing, and how do they think that can be mitigated. And then with that indigenous knowledge, incorporate the scientific models or scientific literature into it, and to actually form a cohesive framework or a cohesive conservation strategy.
That's a great I think a great approach in terms of starting from the bottom up in the communities themselves and finding the answer there. James from Kenya asks, he's an environmental management scientist. He asks, how does human wildlife conflicts correlate with environmental conservation? I don't know if I quite understand this question, but he's yeah. Do you want to try and answer the question?
I'm not exactly sure what it means there as well, but nonetheless, I think human wildlife conflict and environmental, how does he put it? Environmental
Human wildlife
conservation.
conflict
They
correlates with
go
environmental conservation.
Yeah, they go hand in hand. Eh? As a conservationist or as a conservation manager sitting, or a conservation scientist sitting, you're probably responsible for certain area or certain protected area. You know the pressures that the human-induced pressures that are experienced within that region or within that protected area, and hence human wildlife conflict and conservation science go hand in hand. You need to actually, as a conservation manager, as I mentioned earlier, go out to the neighboring communities, understand their problems, understand their dynamics, and actually find out how to actually mitigate these interactions, or mitigate the conflict from them, rather than trying to say, okay, let's build a fence around this protected area so that the people can come in. Trust me, that doesn't work. In the Eastern Cape, people have broken down fences left, right, and center because they feel a sense of ownership towards the game species found within these protected areas. So to answer your question, I believe there's a huge correlation between both the human-wildlife conflict or human-wildlife interaction and conservation science or conservation management.
Absolutely. I think they go hand in hand, actually, especially for
Yeah,
communities that live, like as you said, alongside protected areas or spaces that have wildlife. They go hand in hand. And you'd find that human wildlife conflict is partially a driver for conservation efforts in these areas,
exactly.
also for
Yeah,
conservation education as well. So I'm just going to read some of the comments. Bernice says, hi, everyone. She's joining us from Nairobi, and she's a client activist. And she says they sometimes face attacks from wildlife there who attack their crops because they live near a forest, but they have no compensation, which is quite interesting. Thank you so much, Bernice, for sharing that with us. James writes, asks and writes, what might happen when the population of people grow and live along wildlife corridors, which I think you touched on quite a bit as you were speaking, James. So I hope your question was answered as the talk was going through. Guguletu says wildlife population increases, but the land doesn't. I love this because land is a finite resource. Land doesn't increase, right? But the
yeah.
population is. So managing populations might require culling, but some international laws might not allow for that, especially under CITES. Absolutely. Yeah. And then she asks, what are your comments on CITES, for example, when it comes to especially elephant populations and culling?
Yeah, that's
Yes, yes.
yeah, and I don't want to be misquoted here. And
Good luck.
no, man,
I'm joking.
I strongly believe that there's policies and structures put in place for certain animals and certain so abiding by them is the way to go, and rather than being found unwanting or being found on the other side of the law. So at the moment I feel let's rather abide and to keep
Good
it short.
answer.
Yeah.
Well, with CITES and elephant culling, there are some governments that have spoken uh,
Yeah,
about it, saying that, large elephant populations end up becoming destructive. So it's
yeah,
difficult to manage these populations in the wildlife, in the wilderness, sorry, in the wilderness. And it's a debate, right? Because even when the culling happens, the ivory is kept in storage, and then ivory is not allowed to be, well, it's considered illegal. You can't trade ivory at the moment, unless that's changed in the since I've last checked. So, it's an interesting topic for discussion, Googleto, and I hope Vusi managed to answer your question. If not, you are welcome to get in touch with him to get his opinion. I think he does want to be misquoted here.
you're putting me on the spot now.
That's why
Yeah.
we're here. I'm just joking. So, and then Tobias from Namibia says, to what extent is, oh no, sorry, okay. Tobias from Namibia says, many farmers suffer from losses from elephants and lions. Again, we're back to the elephants. What practical strategies have been most successful in reducing human-wildlife conflict while also protecting local livelihoods?
Can you please repeat that again?
So Tobias is from Namibia, and he's saying many farmers suffer losses from elephants and lions. So he's asking, do you have any practical solutions that have been successful in reducing these types of wildlife conflict and protecting local livestock?
Yeah. There's been certain interventions and so many literature written on this topic. And as I'm not really into the human agricultural space, I'd be happy to recommend some readings to him as well, so that he can also find solutions based on the research that has been done already.
Thank you for that. Yes, I would encourage all of us to Google some articles as well online. There's lots of helpful resources online that can also help us with some of the challenges that we're facing. As you know, the time is always a limiting factor in Trailblazers Hour, so we cannot always get to the nitty-gritty of some of the issues that we bring up. But this is why the space is here for us to have discussions and to talk about these topics at length. Dr. Vusi, before you go, I just wanted to ask one last question, which is actually linked to the last question that I wanted to ask you. Because this is a space for young conservation leaders and people like yourself who are in the conservation and environmental space, who are growing and who are doing remarkable things and sharing their insights here. To what extent is the knowledge gap in terms of how society interacting with wildlife and how, okay, let me try and read this. It's from George Rodney Mafambisa. To what extent is the knowledge gap in terms of how the society interacting with wildlife? I think he's trying to ask, like, what is the knowledge gap between the society, and to what extent is this knowledge gap? Does this knowledge gap exist between, the society and those interacting with wildlife? And how do you see the future of how we can manage these issues due to such a gap? So the knowledge of wildlife and some of the issues of conflict, like, for example, I think around, some of these species of animals that, are deemed culturally taboo, like owls, snakes, etc.
Social ecological systems is a fairly new kind of approach on disciplinary or interdisciplinary sciences is becoming more and more growing, if I may put it like that. So I think the knowledge gap is there but slowly but surely decreasing. People are starting to recognize that ecology or conservation can't work in isolation to other sciences. There need to be a vast integration of social, economical, political, etc., into the conservation space in order to have proper human-wildlife interaction policies, in order to have conservation policies which are actually meaningful, not policies that will just protect humans or policies that will just protect animals. So it needs an integration of all these disciplines in order to make sure that we create policies that actually make sense both to the biodiversity or wildlife and to society as a whole. I don't know if that answers the question.
I mean, it did for me. And I think with what you've just finished, there's a call to action there, the integration of knowledge on top of coexistence. There's an integration of knowledge that needs to happen. And I think you spoke about when you defined what socio-ecological systems actually are. And I think it's important to think of it holistically. And I think to remove some of these perspectives that we might carry because of our past, our upbringing, or whatever it is when it comes to wildlife and to who we are as Africans and our communities and our societies and how we exist with wildlife in general. And I think you've really brought that out, especially with your vast experience, your vast knowledge. All the questions I asked were pretty difficult and you nailed them, Dr. Vusi. I'm really glad we had this chat and we got this opportunity to speak with you. Your vast knowledge and just your passion for the subject came through mightily, and I'm sure everybody agrees with me. And I just wanted to give you a round of applause as we say thank you so much for joining us this evening on Trailblazers and for being such an incredible speaker, Dr. Vusi. Thank you all for clapping for Dr. Vusi, the virtual clap.
Thank you so much, Sam and team, for inviting me. And this was really, really a nice one. I really enjoyed speaking to you guys and interacting with the audience in general.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Vusi and Sam. I really enjoyed. So, Dr. Vusi and Dr. Sam, I really enjoyed this talk. the conversation, and we have learned a lot.